It's going to be a second. So I was really environmentally unfriendly. I printed all of my slides out with the notes and everything and then promptly left them at home. So, my bad. Yeah. All right, so I'm sure you guys saw the, that's really loud, right? No? Oh, it sounds really loud to me. You guys have seen the fantastic graphic there. We're going to talk about Ezra and Nehemiah this quarter. The reason that we're going to talk about Ezra and Nehemiah this quarter is because last year when they were doing Lads to Leaders, Matt was giving, it may have been at his wrap-up talk, I'm not sure, but sometime during the year, it occurred to me that that's going on downstairs, and if you don't have little kids or children that are participating in that, it might just kind of be invisible to you, and it would be a really good thing if the whole congregation were engaged with that, because it's a good work. And I don't intend to make this particular class the same sort of style of class that they're going through, where they're, for Bible Bowl, they'll be really digging into the minutia of the text, and they'll be responding to questions that are a little crazy. Sometimes you think, wow, how did you remember to pick that? How did you even see that to pick that question out, right? But the idea was to have everybody here moving through the same books at the same time. So if you want to be an adult coach for some of the memory verses or those things that are happening, you'll have a familiarity with the at least the Bible Bowl portion of that program. And the goal here is to be creating those relationships amongst the older people and the younger people, right? That's a scriptural thing. We're supposed to teach the younger, right? And then also to create an understanding of the text and have that be applicable to our lives daily, right? So some strange question, but why were we given these books, right? Well, there will be a spiritual application for us. It is relevant to us, and we're going to dig through these two books of history, and we're going to find ways to apply them to ourselves in our modern time. So before we get going on that, those of you who've had me for class before or who've sat through a Devo, I know that my vision of my teaching style is that meme of the guy who's got the kind of crazy eyes and the strings and the paper all behind him, you know, with his developing his theory. I realize I jump around a lot and I'm maybe not the most consistent. So if you are thinking that I didn't say something, or if you got lost on the way, put up your hand, flag me down. But if you've had my class before, you also know I am deaf. So if you're talking back there, you've got to speak very loudly. And I know that was brought up this morning as a topic of concern, that this side can't hear that side when you ask questions. So I will make an effort to repeat the question back as much as I can. However, please, you know, how many of you prefer a discussion class versus a lecture class? Right? So, okay, those of you who raised your hands, would be awesome if you could support discussion by coming in a little closer. Maybe not tonight, but maybe think about next week, filling in these spaces up here so we can have a little better roundtable type discussion. All right, so let's get going.
Them and I'll do what they used to do to us elders. Put us on as a team and have them ask the questions, and I'll see if we can answer their questions.
Okay. All right. So
Elders, think about what was being taught.
I like that, Joe. I think about that. Maybe like the last class of this quarter, we can have the kids come up here and quiz us. What do you guys think? Does that sound like a fun thing to do? And I think we can maybe Kahoot or something like that. Maybe we could do a little.
It's on your teaching though, doesn't it, Jenny?
That's right. I will put it on the line. I'll.
Kids downstairs in my class learned all 66 books and what they mean, so we read.
Okay. All right. So I always feel like it's a good thing to know where we are when we're reading in the Bible, what's happening around these times, why are we being told these things, or why were the people experiencing those things, right? So going back a little bit, this is happening at the end of the Babylonian captivity. So Daniel and Ezekiel are written during the captivity. Ezra, Esther, and Nehemiah are all written in a pretty approximate time frame. And when we get to Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, now these are books of prophecy, right? So we're covering books of history, but the prophecies from Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, those were pretty concurrent with Nehemiah through the span of time that Nehemiah covers. And I apologize, I looked through our YouTube stuff to see what dates, because Keith has covered these three books, I think. He certainly covered Haggai. Haggai was the only one I could spot, and that was from September the 7th. So if you want to get some background information about what the prophecies were, watch Keith's sermon or lesson or whatever from September 7th. All right, so that was kind of the biblical narrative space. From a historical standpoint, these books come out, so 538, yeah. So it was written about 538. But now this guy up here, that's King Cyrus. It's a relief that still exists representing him. Our author Ezra, he didn't really introduce himself, like a lot of the books of Paul. He just right out of the gate says, hey, this is who this is, and this is where I'm writing to. Ezra starts out a little bit more abrupt, right to the heart of the matter. But we'll get a little more introduction on him when we come to chapter 7, because that's when he introduces himself. So we'll put that off tonight, and we'll move out to King Cyrus. So always tough for me with the BC dates because they're backwards, right? But King Cyrus was king from 590 to 529 BC. So we see towards the end of his reign over the Persian Empire that these events are happening near the end of his reign. And part of that is because when he conquered Nebuchadnezzar, who had taken Judah into captivity, right? So this King Cyrus, outside of the Bible, he's renowned really for how he treated his subjects, right? The manner that he governed as he's conquering all of these countries, he pretty much left them to their own devices, right? The Jews had been sort of relocated, but that's because Babylon relocated them. And when Cyrus took over, he didn't send them back until later. but he certainly treated them, the Jews, and all of his other people far better than the kings that we see. Referring back to Keith's classes on the minor prophets, a lot of the minor prophets were testifying against kings and kingdoms because of the horrible violence and the way that they were stealing from the poor and oppressing people. Where Cyrus, I didn't bring a picture of it, but there's a large cylinder, because of the way these guys had their alphabet and their language. There's this large cylinder that's considered the original, the first Bill of Rights. And it was the law of how the king in the kingdom would treat the servants or the civilians of the country, right? So all of this is going down in what would be Iran today, right? So that gives you some idea of where it's at. But we've got some maps we're going to come on to maybe. One of the things that sort of ancillary to this is, you all know the movie 300. You've heard about the Spartans and the Thermopylae, right? Well, those are Greeks. They're fighting Persians. So they didn't really get along. They really didn't get along very well at all. But Cyrus was so impressive for the way that he treated people. One of the Grecian historians wrote a very positive book about him, and that book was owned, 2 copies, in fact, by our founder, Thomas Jefferson, right? So this man has a historical line that runs relevant to us, right? Our documents, our founding documents, and the liberties and freedoms that we have link all the way back to this guy, right? But there's something more impressive about this guy. That's really tiny. Sorry. I'll read it. It says, in Isaiah chapter 44 and verse 28, "Who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill my purpose, saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple your foundation shall be laid." And then skipping to Isaiah 45, verse 1 to 5. "Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the belt of kings, to open doors before him, that gates may not be closed. I will go before you and level the exalted places. I will break in pieces the doors of bronze and cut through the bars of iron. I will give you treasures of darkness and hoards in secret places, that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who will call you by your name for your sake, of my servant Jacob and Israel, my chosen. I call you by your name, I name you, though you do not know me. I am the Lord, and there is no other besides me. There is no God. I equip you, though you do not know me." So, who knows what's really significant about those verses? It was centuries before, yeah. So God is prophesying about a specific man, giving him a name years and years before he was even born, right? This is a biblical proof text, by the way, in case you ever run into somebody that doesn't think the Bible's inspired. So the captivity of Israel, or of Judah, started in 587. And if you remember, Cyrus became king in 590 over in Persia. Babylon takes Israel into captivity just a little bit after Cyrus became king himself. They were conquered by Nebuchadnezzar II, and the first temple, Solomon's temple, is destroyed at that time. he packs them all off to basically Babylon. And he takes Daniel with him. But in Daniel 10:1, we see that he kind of moved to the next administration. When Cyrus came in, Daniel got to stay along, and I'm sure we all know that's God's providence. And we're pretty familiar with Josephus. He has a little chapter in his records that shows that Cyrus was told by somebody, and the theory is that it was Daniel, that, hey, the Jews have this prophecy about you, right? And the thought is that when those verses that we just read were read to Cyrus, he was convinced of it, and he knew it was about him. And that's what led him to make the declaration that we're going to read in a second about sending them back and building the temple. And I think it's particularly interesting that not only did he send them back, but he funded it. And there's some relationships that we'll think about as we get there regarding that as well. And something happened to Cyrus. It's a little bit unclear. There's several stories about how he died. But around 530 BC, he was killed, probably in a military campaign or as a result of a loss. So before we go on, I kind of wanted to have this class, like I said, be a mix of facts, details, right, but also application points and discussion. So I think it's very interesting about why Cyrus is chosen by God. And one of the questions, and it's kind of a serious question, do you think he was chosen because of his nature, this merciful nature, or do you think he was given a merciful nature because he was chosen? Anybody want to address that? See, we're gonna have to do some more. I'm gonna have to do some more work on getting you guys warmed up, I think.
Hey, Jamie?
Yes, sir.
And I think you mentioned it earlier, but there was a clear difference between the Babylonians and how they handled conquered nations and how the Persians handled conquered nations. Babylonians had a tendency to kind of wipe the slate clean and relocate everybody. The Persians, and you mentioned it, would tend to come in, they would conquer the people, and they would leave them kind of to their own devices. And so from that standpoint, I think he had that nature in advance. It was more of a policy of the Persians and how they handled captives. And I think that he had that probably prior to hearing that he was, if you will, the chosen one or the prophesied one of God, because that was their policy even before that time.
You're absolutely. So Mark is saying that he clearly, because this was at the kind of end of his run when he takes over for Nebuchadnezzar, the idea that they're already being merciful, they're already treating these people this way, that is probably his nature, and he may have been therefore chosen because of his nature, right? I think it's interesting that when you look at the prophecy about him in Isaiah 44:28, he is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill all my purpose. Who does that sound like? Christ, right? This is like a foreshadowing of Christ, right? So he's going to release Israel from bondage, just like Christ releases us from our bondage, right?
Back to your earlier question, I don't know which it is, but one thing is God was involved. Back to your prophecy in Isaiah 45:13, it's towards the end, it says, God says, I will stir up his spirit. that's prophecy. And then in Second Chronicles, chapter, I think it's 37, verse 22, it says, "Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled." And that's Jeremiah 29:10.
Yeah.
The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it in writing. So God was behind it all, I guess is my only point.
Absolutely. Yep. Matt's pointing out that there are some additional prophecies that I didn't pull in Isaiah 29 or Jeremiah 29 that talk about God moving Cyrus, right? That he directly influenced him to make these decisions. All right. Before we'll read Ezra chapter 1 in a second. It's only 11 verses. How many of you are familiar with Ezra chapter 2? Don't panic. Everybody else, be blissfully okay. Several places in the Bible, the captivity is said to be 70 years. Israel will be in Babylonian captivity for 70 years. However, if you add up the dates that we have for various historical records, right, it comes up short. It doesn't show up as 70 years. And there's a lot of debate about that, with some people saying, well, God just sort of rounded it off, right? That doesn't really feel like how God operates with us. It's not how he communicates to us. I think I am more in line with, and we will continue through this class with the idea that there's some ambiguity as to when you would count the captivity as being over, right? So like I said, I'll give you the slide there. The short version is getting out of captivity is a process, right? And it's not something that has a firm cut date in this case, because you're going to see multiple returns of people leaving out of Babylon and going home, right? So how we count that end date, we're going to say that's a little bit nebulous, and we're going to say God is correct in what he's communicated in the scriptures. It's 70 years, okay?
The years, I know, as far as the temple was destroyed in 586, and it was finished being rebuilt in 516, so that was your 70 years. I think we can look at that. Research that a little bit. Have you researched that?
There are a lot of different timelines that people have generated, and you know, each person who's got a timeline is very enthusiastic about their defense of their timeline.
So the question is, there's a lot of issues with the timing of what we know from secular history.
Right.
However, in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 10, which I alluded to, or was mentioned before, that specifically is a prophecy by Jeremiah. That would be 70 years.
Yep.
There's another one in Jeremiah. And then, so the question is it kind of 70 or close, or is it exactly? Well, if you go to Daniel chapter 9, verses 1 through 3, it's interesting because what you take away from that is that Daniel perceived it to be a literal 7 years. So what does it say? In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, by the descent of Mede, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that, according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, must pass before the end of the desolation of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So Daniel thought it was exactly 70 years.
Yep.
He was counting it. And then he goes and prays, and then God sends Gabriel to go talk to him, and basically gives him the background of what would actually occur.
Yep.
To me, it's fascinating because God's behind this all, but that tells me it's exactly 70 years.
Yep.
Whether we have secular history that supports that or not.
And that's what I'm saying. We're going to go with these, you can see these verses up here. We've got Daniel 9:2, which you just covered, Zechariah 1:12, and Zechariah 7:5. Very, very firmly say 70 years. So we're going in this class with God's right. He said 70, it means 70. I will say this, is it 70.5? Is it 70.0? I'm not concerned about that, but it's 70, right? All right, let's at least read through Ezra, and then let's at least be able to see our phone well enough to find Ezra. There we go. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And let each survivor in whatever place he sojourns, be assisted by the men of his place, with silver and gold, with goods and with beasts, besides free will offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. Then rose up the heads of the fathers' houses of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, everyone whose spirit God had stirred to go up to rebuild the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem. And all who were about them aided them with vessels of silver, with gold, with goods, with beasts, and with costly wares. Besides all that was freely offered, Cyrus the king also brought out the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and placed in the house of his gods. Cyrus, king of Persia, brought these out in the charge of Mithredath, the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. And this was the number of them: 30 basins of gold, 1,000 basins of silver, 29 censers, 30 bowls of gold, 410 bowls of silver, and 1,000 other vessels. All the vessels of gold and of silver were 5,400. All these did Sheshbazzar bring up when the exiles were brought from Babylonia to Jerusalem. All right. So there are a couple of people that we passed by in that we'll talk about. Sheshbazzar, definitely a prominent Jew, right? Because he's been called in and given all of this gold, right? People think that this is Zerubbabel. And few people think that it's not Zerubbabel, but actually his uncle, right? For the purposes of this class, I think we're going to assume that this is the name the Chaldeans gave Zerubbabel. So Sheshbazzar, Zerubbabel, we in this class, unless somebody has a compelling argument otherwise, are going to treat them as the same guy. And I think it's interesting, Matt talked about, I think it was the names that were given to Daniel and Azariah. Right. We always call them by their Babylonian names, which were actually offensive names for a Jew, right? Because they praised the Babylonian gods. And this is the same sort of situation. This name actually means, may Shamash protect the father. And so I think that's what we're looking at here is the notes that are coming out of the Persian Empire. You know, this was kind of an accounting document. Well, we gave you all of this stuff. They're going to call him Sheshbazzar, okay? Later, when it's the interactions of the Jews with God and within their own, government, they're talking about Zerubbabel. All right, and then this other dude, Mithredath. he's in this case, the Persian treasurer. We're going to see this name pop up again in chapter 4. It's probably a different person. Not necessarily, but probably a different person, okay? So let's look and see. I don't know if you can see on the bigger map here, but this area right here, this is where the Jews have been relocated to, and that's right around the city of Babylon. And what you're looking at on the whole map here is King Nebuchadnezzar. This is the area that he controlled, right? So this, I apologize, I couldn't get two maps from the same cartographer that would line up with one another. This is Cyrus's kingdom, and if you looked before, Nebuchadnezzar was just at the edge of this lake, right? So he was here. Cyrus has been much more successful and enlarged quite a good bit over where Babylon was. And the other piece, we will eventually, we're not going to have time tonight, but we will look at how long it's going to take them to walk across from Jerusalem over here, right? So we are bumping on the edge of time to go. So I think we'll come back here next week and we'll start with the journey, the physical journey from Babylon back to Jerusalem. So can we be dismissed with a prayer? Heavenly